Well, of course, as we've mentioned many times, but you don't need to tell anybody in the U.S., Monday is Memorial Day, and we're headed towards that long weekend. But it isn't really just about picnics and hot dogs and playing frisbee with the family at the beach. It's about what it means, and that is that we remember those men and women who have served our country or countries. Of course, we got many folks listening in Canada today. We remember that they gave their lives in service to our country, and we want to remember them on Memorial Day. But in preparation for that, we've wanted to talk about some of the things related to this issue of service in the military, and one of them being the kind of traumatic experience a member of the military can have, and that many do have when they serve in our military. Greg WARK is the author of a book, co-author actually, with Ray Rodriguez, of a book called The Warfighter's Soul. It's about engaging in the battle for the warrior's soul. And I hope that you'll stick around and join the conversation here. In fact, call somebody you know who has either been involved in military service or has a family member or a loved one involved in military service, because I think this is going to be well worth listening to. By the way, Greg WARK has served over 27 years, nearly 30 years, in leadership development of military and law enforcement personnel, and for good reason. They face a lot of trauma in the workplace. But he holds a master's in theology, a doctor of ministry degree, and also serves as a chaplain for a federal law enforcement agency. But I want to welcome him here. Greg is in Nashville, Tennessee, I think. And Greg, welcome to NBL. How are you?
Thanks, Neil. I appreciate you bringing me on, especially for this Memorial Day time. One of the things you mentioned is really important to me, that we don't just see it as a day off, but we recognize the incredible sacrifice our military men and women and our first responders and law enforcement give to provide us with the freedom and safety that allows us to have this incredible day off. And so thank you for that.
Yeah, well, you are welcome, and thank you for joining us here to help prepare for the weekend and to maybe go into it with a better understanding of what people face when they do serve in the military. So it's called The Warfighter's Soul, Engaging in the Battle for the Warrior's Soul, and that's a pretty heavy title. Like, that carries some weight, and I wanted to give you a chance not only to explain the title, but what the motivation was for actually writing a book on this subject.
Well, the title, at first my publisher didn't really want to use it, but after reading the content, he couldn't think of a better title for it. It's a non-religious book, but it deals with the issues related to the warfighter's soul, obviously, but it breaks down the things that happen when a person exits the civilian world and enters into a world that's dramatically different than anything in humanity. Mm-hmm. I have worked 30 years with mostly special operators, both on the West Coast and East Coast, and then we morphed into working with very unique groups all across the nation and in some other countries. And so during those times, I began to recognize, Neil, that the people that are giving so much often are given very little care to give them the possibility of a life that promises, let's say, for instance, a good marriage, happy family, carefree lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. They're gone from their families sometimes 6 months, a year. That's not including workups and different things they have to do to prepare to deploy. And then they deal with a lot of things that are unimaginable, Neil. And I want to say that we wrote this book to three demographics. Number one, those that are suffering under the traumatic experiences of war and dealing with suicidal ideations. Two, the families of those who are suffering so that they can get a better understanding of what's going on. And number three, to the society that takes advantage of the freedoms that they provide. And the book is really a culmination of things that I've learned to do that are we don't see done except in what we've done. So we want to share that with law enforcement and military personnel so that they can find hope no matter what it is they're going through. They can know that there's a way for them to get better and a way for them to have a rich life.
I remember doing a conversation a number of years ago, I'm not sure, let's say somewhere between 7 and 10 years ago, and it was about a film, a documentary that was put together called Halfway Home. And I don't remember everything about it, but I do remember there was some pretty decorated people that were a part of that had served their time in the military, that were dealing with post-traumatic stress, which is something we're going to talk about today. But there was a scene at the very beginning of the movie. It showed some type of bird of prey, like a hawk or something, just sort of cruising around in the sky, and you hear a voiceover tell a story, and it's a military veteran, a guy who had served in leadership in the military, and he's saying, the bottom line is we send boys and girls off to war, and if they make it home alive, we're thrilled. I'm very much paraphrasing, but we're thrilled that they're home. But he said the truth is they're really only halfway home, because he said imagine that a hawk swoops down and picks up a field mouse from the field. Well, that mouse has just been ripped away from everything that it knew, that felt, that was home. It was a secure place, had no idea its life was in danger. Now, all of a sudden, it's being taken away to be killed. But let's say for some reason the hawk accidentally, drops that field mouse and he's back in his home environment. One thing's for sure, he's back home, but he'll always be vigilant that hawk could come back and get him again. And he's always going to be looking over his shoulder. Life will never be the same for that field mouse, because his life, could be in danger, or he might feel like it's in danger. And I just remember just thinking about that for a minute, from people that have seen grotesque things on the battlefield or who have experienced trauma. And I know that you deal a lot with that. But I wonder if you could comment on that little scenario. Obviously, you didn't see the documentary. I would assume you didn't. But is that in any way accurate to help describe what we're talking about if we mention something like post-traumatic stress?
Yes, it is, actually. I've never heard that, but it's a good story. The interesting thing, Neil, is that we actually began working, let's say, one community, the SEAL community. I had the privilege over many years of working with the students that are working to become SEALs. And so it's a basic underwater demolition SEAL training, which is the acronym BUDS. And what they do is they go through this rigorous training, and then some of them graduate, and they go on to become Navy SEALs to deploy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times to combat. What's interesting is that I'm able to see them and know them personal and up front before and after they experience war. And I can tell you for a surety that there's a dramatic physical change in their eyes, which is one of the reasons we talk about the soul, is that I can tell if a guy has been in combat simply by looking at their eyes. They're different. They have changed. And so when you talk about being dropped into something, there's no way to prepare them for the different things that happen. Just the other day, I was talking to a veteran, and I was counseling him, and he mentioned that, well, let me make this statement before I bring this story up.
Sure.
Combat trauma it is not necessarily what we think it is. Trauma is what happens in the gray of war. So a good example is a friend of mine, he's a legendary Delta operator, was telling me a story, and the story was that they went into a village and had to eliminate all of the Al-Qaeda operatives there. And he actually said this to me. He said, it never, ever bothered me killing enemies. It never bothered me. But he said, he was going on telling the story that they had to clear all the houses and rooms to make sure there were no squirters, is what they call them. Mm-hmm. And he was right at the front, 6'5" big guy, kicked down the door, and behind the door was a little old woman. And when he was telling me that story, he broke down for the next 20 minutes. He couldn't He couldn't even talk. And it was because that little old woman reminded him of his grandmother. Now, I want you to, the reason I bring that story is I want you to understand trauma doesn't fit into everything they do is traumatic. It's gray. It happens, let's say, for instance, another gentleman told me that he watched a suicide bomber blow himself up. None of the stuff that happened around him bothered him, but that haunted him until we were able to help him with it. Mm. And so these are the kind of things that most civilians don't understand when they're looking at the issue of war. And certainly if you bring up the issue of veteran suicide, that is a conundrum for people. They don't get it, but we do. I can explain that if you want me to.
Yeah, please do.
So one of the reasons that veterans are committing suicide at ridiculous numbers is because when they are in the cloister of their group, their team, their unit, they're all doing the same missions. They're all going through the same experiences. And if one guy is struggling, there's a protection in that everybody has seen and experienced the same thing, and they can kind of protect each other. So you don't see a lot of suicides when individuals are serving in a unit. The problems happen when they are terminal or when they're done with their careers in the military. So they go from being an asset, like an amazing asset, millions of dollars have been put into them to make them a killing machine or a protection machine. So they get out of the military and suddenly they're in an environment where there's absolutely no structure, there are no boundaries, the people don't really understand them as warriors, and so they're treated with something of a mild neglect, not out of a desire to abuse them, but simply they're just not understood. And so they are then forced to develop an alter ego, which is a second person, because their family wants them to be, quote, normal. The society wants them to be, quote, normal. Everybody around them. So they create this alter ego that is normal. But when they go to bed at night and they lay their head down on their pillow, the alter ego is not the one sleeping on that pillow. The one on that pillow is the one that is struggling with the images, smells, sights, all the things
right.
associated with that individual's trauma. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Now,
and so after a while, they're unable. After a while, we just lost a SEAL Team commanding officer, SEAL Team 2. You know, that guy's at the pinnacle, the height of his career. Why would he kill himself? Well, this is the reason. After a while, you cannot maintain those two personas. The one that will win will be the one that has experienced these things. And the problem is, once you're an asset and you realize you're a liability, that's it. You're not going to put up with being a liability. You'd rather be dead than be a liability.
That's understandable the way you just described it, but I also think it feels helpless. Is there hope? Because, I mean, obviously you're involved in helping to people to deal with post-traumatic stress, to work through these things, and yet the suicide rate is astronomical. So something's missing in the equation. Either we need more of you or more assistance, once people return from the military, maybe even assistance while they're still on the battlefield. Like there's got to be some hope somewhere.
Well, there is hope. The problem is that everything that they are told to rely on has none. So the VA doesn't know what to do. They have been just tripled the budget for suicide awareness, and it's done no damn good at all. And so we have suicides at 20 to 40 a day. It's just inexcusable. So what I've done is I've gone on national TV and done radio shows like yours, Neil, and I'm basically calling out to all of the entrepreneurial people that may fit into my category who have ideas, but those ideas just need to have a place to land where we can help these guys. So the Warfighter's Soul deals with it shares 5 different things that we use or do to bring a person who's suicidal or dealing with trauma to a place of wholeness. We've learned to restructure trauma. so that it's like, so a good example of what trauma is like if you suddenly put your hand with your fingers stretched out in front of your face, that's trauma. That trauma does not move, it stays there. And after a while, your brain just accepts it. And so you get used to looking through life through an obstacle. So you look at your wife, you look at your family, you look at your work, you look at yourself in the mirror through this obstacle. And that's what trauma is. What we've learned to do is to break the power of the trauma so that it can become a memory. And once a trauma has been restructured to a memory, it becomes a strength. And you'll see that in many of the military people who have managed to work through that trauma and have gone through suicidal attempts. Many of the people I know have, and they actually become incredible helpers of other veterans and other people in society because they now know that there's hope. They now know there's a way to be helped without getting a bag of drugs from the VA and a bunch of psychobabble that is not fixing anything.
Well, there's so much to talk about. Hang on a minute. We're going to continue our conversation. Greg WARK has served nearly 30 years in leadership development for the military and for law enforcement personnel, and he holds a master's degree in theology, a doctor of ministry degree as well. He also serves as a chaplain for a federal law enforcement agency, and I got to believe some of the trauma that law enforcement officials face is in some ways similar. We can talk about that as we continue. But the book is called The Warfighter's Soul, Engaging in the Battle for the Warrior's Soul. I assume it's available at Amazon, and if there's another website or any other resources, we can talk about that when NBL returns. But sit tight. There's more to come as we continue with Greg WARK, W-A-R-K, on today's edition of NBL. It's brought to you by the Niagara Gospel Mission, where right there in Niagara Falls, they have a center for homeless veterans. They actually are reaching out to those who have served in the military who, for whatever reason, may be facing homelessness right now. They're doing what they can to minister the love of Christ and to help people in need. Give generously to the work of the Niagara Gospel Mission by going to NGM, the NiagaraGospelMission.com, NiagaraGospelMission.com. All right, we're back again here on this Thursday edition of NBL. Greg WARK, our guest, and of course, Memorial Day is coming. We wanted to spend some time just talking about the military and what our, those who served in the military are going through. Many gave their lives in service to our country, and that's why we celebrate Memorial Day. That's what's coming up on Monday, and we thank God for their service. But there are many others who, in other ways, kind of gave their lives by serving because they've never been able to get their real life back. They're dealing with trauma that's unresolved. And as a result, it's not only affecting them, it's affecting their families, it's affecting our communities, and many are ending up taking their lives at an alarming rate. And that's exactly where Greg WARK is. It's what he's doing, working with individuals who are dealing with this kind of thing. I don't even know where to go from here because there's so much to talk about. But help us understand, what someone does who may be living with a person struggling with post-traumatic stress. You're seeing them maybe in more of a clinical or counseling setting, I would think. But what about the people that deal with them on a regular basis? Are there tips to help, spot suicidal behavior? Or at what point do you realize that what your loved one is dealing with is way more serious than you first imagined? How do you spot that kind of thing?
Well, in the book, we've actually written about 5 signs and syndromes of suicidal ideations. And it's basically kind of a roadmap. It's at least a beginning roadmap. Look, if you see this behavior, we call one the Superman syndrome. We call another one, the silent, the person that's just constantly silent, has no opinion, dramatic change in the type of person that they were. All those are signs and syndromes that can lead to these destructive paths. So I really want to encourage people to get the book and to, learn those things. But the one thing is that I got to tell you that there's a special type of human being on this earth today, and that is the spouses of those who serve in law enforcement and those who are in military wives and spouses and husbands. These people, they live. Neil, you and I have this life where our families see us every day, and they don't have to think too much about whether we're coming home or going to show up at their baseball game or do whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But that is certainly not the case. I mean, you got to live. And I've sat there with the families of people in combat situations who have lost someone in that context or are concerned about losing someone in that context. And man, that's a huge thing, and we don't often recognize the sacrifice that's made by them.
Yeah, because every person who takes their life, and what did you say it was? Was it 40 to 60 people a day?
Well, it's actually Fox just did a study, and it's up to 40 a day.
Okay.
The people that I talk to, there is a 300% rise in special operations suicides now. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we just ripped them out of a combat situation and stuck them just stick them home. And, you go from one thing and the next day it's over. And it's really difficult to make that turn.
Right.
It's if not next to impossible. It's important that we know that some of the suicides are with World War II guys. Not very many, but this is a very, very difficult problem. And I really want to talk to you about some of the treatments we have.
Well, please do. But before we get there, let me just say this. I want anyone listening right now to really think about what 40 people a day looks like. And, maybe next time you see a picture of your favorite, baseball player up at bat and they show the crowd scene and you can maybe see a couple thousand people in the background in that photo. Just imagine if all of a sudden 40 of them weren't there every single day. That's 280 by the end of the week, if my math is correct. It wouldn't take long before that photo would be empty. I mean, this is a tremendous problem. And if it can be slowed, I don't know if it can be 100% reversed, but if it can be slowed significantly, then we need to know about that. So, all right, so what are the treatments for post-traumatic stress and what people are facing in these kinds of situations?
Well, the very first thing that we do, in bringing a person who's traumatized through combat, the very first thing we do is they have to identify the trauma. Very often, those who are traumatized they've somehow made their trauma not one, or they don't recognize it as such. It's an absolute first step. They have to identify it. Let me give you an example. I had a special operator I was working with recently, actually, and he was telling me his story, and we do a lot of this. The storytelling is really important because it reveals things. Mm-hmm. So he's telling his story, and he talks about his childhood being such a wonderful time with his father, and his father made him the tough man he is. He was the highest level of special operator on Earth. And we're kind of going past his childhood and we're moving into his youth and then into his going into the Army. And all of a sudden he says, well, my dad used to beat me every single day with a metal belt buckle. And so I was the one listening and recording what he was doing to write it down. And so I looked at him and I said, bro, do you beat your kids with a belt buckle? And he goes, why would I do that? And I said, your dad beats you every day with a belt buckle. And I said, you know what we call that? We call that child abuse. And so I know that story was a little bit long. The point I'm trying to make is he never saw that as child abuse. Wow. He had to, but in order for him to get better, he had to recognize it, and he had to do the second thing, which is to own it. In other words, I was an abused child. Are you with me?
Oh, totally, absolutely.
Okay. So see, the first thing we need to do to get better from trauma is we have to acknowledge it and then own it.
Okay, but hang on. So that's you call that identifying the trauma, right? Okay, but
right.
Let's go back to the story you told earlier about the 6'5" guy who kicked down a door and saw a little grandma there, and that somehow became his trauma because it reminded him of his own grandmother. Okay,
that's right.
Now fast forward to the story you just told us about the guy with the belt buckle. Here's my question. They go to war and they experience horrendous things on the battlefield. Does that somehow marry itself to the past trauma of their childhood and exacerbate that problem, or are the two completely unrelated? I guess is what. In other words, is somebody more susceptible to facing trauma in military service if they've had experienced child abuse as a kid, like you just told us?
Well, that's a really good question, but I'm gonna answer it with most people don't realize this, but 80% of the people who sign up to go to the hardest training on earth for special operators either have no father figure or no father figure.
Wow.
Now you think about that. What is driving them to do something that is next to humanly impossible? It is the childhood trauma of not having the guidance and direction associated, or a poor father figure direction. So the answer, I think, really is yes. And by the way, I think all trauma marries itself to new trauma. So trauma, if it's not dealt with, it just simply exacerbates itself. Now, in many cases, in the guys that I've talked to and mentored over the years, they revealed that there were some serious issues with their past.
Right.
But instead of becoming a victim, they use that pain to become something supernatural. Is that making sense?
Yeah. But in a sense that kind of doesn't sound healthy. Maybe I'm missing something, but it's sort of like, hey, I've got this pain, so I'm not going to let it hold me back. I'm going to become Superman. I'm going to be Rambo, and I'm going to go out on the battlefield and protect my country. But that actually sounds like an action that's coming from a place of sickness as opposed to health, emotionally, mentally, whatever. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. But is that a good thing or a bad thing to become Superman?
I think so, Neil. The answer to that is I think it's depending upon how the person handles themselves after they're involved in it, in what they're doing.
Okay.
Some people, they'll have a support structure that will help them through that. Ultimately, though, the issue becomes a real problem when they get out of the military and all that stuff comes falling down on them again. They don't have an outlet to deal with it. So when you're in the military, you have an outlet to deal with all that. And that you're with brothers who are doing the same.
Yeah.
But when you're not in the military, you don't have that anymore.
Right.
And that's why when you lay down to sleep, you can't get REM sleep. You're having to take pills to deal with lack of sleep for 3-4 days. I mean, it's torture. So what we do is, that's why we start with their childhood. We're not into some big old psychological thing, but the bottom line of it is, if we're going to find your trauma, let's find it.
Right.
Let's get to it all.
Okay.
And let's deal with it all, because we need you back in the game.
All right. So identify trauma, face the trauma, identify what it is. What's the next step in treatment?
Write it.
Write it. Okay.
So there's something that happens to the soul of a hurting person when they put down on paper the unspeakable. So let's say, for instance, I think what I said just stands on its own.
Right.
So when you write something, it's really a powerful moment. This process is called breaking the power of trauma. But when you write it, it's like, I've never seen this written in words. I mean, I've sat down with hundreds of guys who told me stories that never told another human being. And you can't imagine both the freedom and the anguish that comes in that process.
Isn't that amazing?
And so
I'm just amazed.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea of finally getting that weight off your chest. It's almost like, the moment somebody receives Christ as their Savior, they ask forgiveness for their sins and sometimes name them, but they recognize in that moment that there's no more hiding. It's not a secret anymore, that somebody else is helping to bear the weight, and that they don't need to live in the darkness. They can live in the light. And all of that seems to it sounds similar to what you're describing. When they write it, when they talk about it, that there's some sort of a release. It's understandable.
There is, in fact, we actually call the next step memorializing what you've written. So I actually have spent many been to Israel 28 times. I've spent a lot of time doing documentaries and film and stuff over there. And one time I was over there, and I was sitting above the Jordan River. We just finished filming. I was just cooling off and just kind of enjoying the view. And I began to have this moment where I started to think through all the historical things that had happened at the Jordan River. And I saw the Israelites coming across the Jordan River and ending in the land of promise. And the first thing God had them do is he said, I want you to build a memorial.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most people think a memorial is something that's past. What we don't realize is a memorial represents both the end of one thing, but also the entry of another.
That's right.
So so that's one of the things that we do through fire. Now, we're not walking on it, so just you can let that go.
Okay.
But what we do is we have a fire pit, and wherever we go, I don't care where it is, we'll take that paper. Now, the paper, what's written on it could be embarrassing. It could be something that brings great fear. It's legible. People can see it. It's vulnerability. All that is there until the moment you put it on the fire. And when you put it on the fire, it ceases to be legible, and it becomes another substance altogether. It becomes ash. And in that moment is when we see the breath, the guys let out their breath and fall on their, just put their hands in their face because they felt the freedom of having what has plagued their soul now no longer plaguing their soul. And the last step is we take them through the power of renunciation of its hold or its control from then on.
Yeah. We're going to need to take a break, but as you're saying all of that, I'm thinking about some of the other trauma stories I've heard over the years in speaking with military personnel. And sometimes, it's because maybe they experienced trauma because they were on the battlefield when their spouse died back at home, or they saw a friend, step on a landmine, or like you mentioned, a guy watched a suicide bomber take his own life, and that was his trauma. But in some cases, it's because in combat, somebody literally needed to take the life of another, and they feel, who am I to take human life? And yet I had to do it, and I just can't get it out of my head. These are horrific traumas, and praise God for people like Greg WARK, W-A-R-K, and his co-author, Ray Rodriguez, who wrote this book, which I highly recommend, called The Warfighter's Soul. It's about engaging in the battle for the warrior's soul, because suicide is on the rise, and we need to do everything we possibly can to offer assistance and support and love and concern for those who are struggling. But, Greg, just before break here, and we got to move quickly, but is there any other website, like any kind of a site where people can reach you directly or resources? Obviously, the book, I would assume, can be purchased at Amazon, right? The Warfighter's Soul.
Anywhere, any bookstore.
Okay.
Any bookstore, but we also have the warfightersoul.org.
Okay.
Website, and we've produced a membership, and there's a lot of growth. We're actually writing several new books right now, one for police, one for the spouses. We're doing one for the Border Patrol, which is being really hit hard with suicide.
Right.
So yeah, it's a big issue.
Okay. We've got to take a break. There's a few minutes left. We'll be back with more of NBL in just a moment. Greg WARK, W-A-R-K, is co-author of the book, The Warfighter's Soul. But for those of you living in the greater Toronto area, if you want to call Cornerstone Bookshop and ask John Todros to order some copies and save them for you, when you get to the front desk, they'll have them waiting for you. so you don't have to run in there and find out they've already sold out. But The Warfighter's Soul from Greg WARK. We'll be back with more of NBL in just a moment. Today's program is brought to you by Cornerstone Bookshop. All right, let's get back to it. A few minutes left here with Greg WARK. How do you say your last name? WARK?
It's War with a K.
WARK. Okay. Excellent.
Yep.
Appreciate that help. All right, so, I don't know how much time you want to spend on treatment, but you mentioned identifying the trauma, writing it down, memorializing it by putting it in the fire. Are there additional steps? I think you mentioned there was 5.
There are. So there's the identify, own it, write it, memorialize it, and renounce it. So renunciation is the last one. Yeah, the renunciation is a very powerful word, and I know they use it in some religions in a way that we don't use it. Renunciation is simply, it takes a word beyond just the words spoken to an oath. It's saying, I refuse to allow the memory of what has taken place in my life to have one more minute of control over the way I look at life, my family, my future, etc. And in doing so, that finalizes the process of breaking the power of the trauma. But Neil, it's really important that I mention this, is that over the years I've learned that is not enough. It's a moment of euphoria. It's a moment where the sufferer becomes literally free. You can see it literally when they go through that process. But the issue is that over the years of carrying trauma, we develop patterns that are destructive. Alcoholism, anger, outbursts. You could fill in the blank. There's hundreds of them. But those are developed. The way we view ourselves, the way we view life. The reason that veterans are homeless is because of that. So what we do is we take them through another 5-step process of breaking the patterns, and that's a whole other subject. But they have to break the patterns they've developed, so self-destructive patterns, and replace them with healthy ones.
Have you ever met somebody with PTSD that wasn't dealing with something like addiction, anger issues, or suicidal thoughts?
No.
Okay. So
the answer is no.
This is commonplace.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Common. Yeah. And really, I've dealt with some of the guys that are, and I thank God for this, but I've dealt with people that would scare most people to death just to look at them.
Why?
Because they look brutal. They're intimidating. That's their caricature that they've carried into battle, and they've developed hardened. They're hardened individuals, and you have to get through that. Well, that's one of the reasons why. Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say, well, don't lose your thought, because I want to hear where you were going. But so when somebody comes to sit down and have a conversation with you, are they usually willing? Because my point is, if you run into somebody at the local bus station or whatever, and they look scary and intimidating, and they're dealing with PTSD, but you don't really know that, and they got all this stuff going on, and maybe they're having suicidal thoughts, are those people generally willing to say, man, I'm losing it here, I need some help, so I'm going to sit down and talk with Greg WARK or someone else who's trained in trauma counseling and this kind of ministry and whatever? Like, are most people willing, or do they have to be convinced that they have a problem? Because I would think that in some cases they're trying to cover their pain with drugs or alcohol or whatever, and are pretending, like you said earlier, kind of wearing the mask. They're trying to get everybody the happy face that they're fine, but they're really not. So, like, do you have to do work to convince them they have a problem, or by the time they get to you, are most of them saying, look, if you can't give me some help, my life's over?
Well, they usually are not prepared for what I'm about to bring out of them. That's more than often the case. And not just me, but all the people that we train.
Right.
We don't deal in hyperbole. We don't deal in feel-good conversations. We deal with a warfighter through brutal communication. And there's a reason for it, because that's what they're used to. If you talk to someone who's hurting and has been in combat, and you start treating them like they're in somebody's chair for an hour getting counseling, you're done. You lost them. But if you talk to them the way they're used to being talked to, all of a sudden all of the walls come down.
Really interesting.
And it's quite fascinating. So the person like me, I've talked to guys where I figured, all right, I'm about to be dead, or I'm about to break through. And that's literally how sometimes it feels. I mean, I had this one guy. He's well known in special operations. He took out some of the most ruthless, brutal dictators on earth. The guy has one eye. He's got a big old beard, and he's the most intimidating human being I've ever known. But sitting down with him, it took about 5 minutes for us to have a rapport.
Wow.
And I think, and so there's not a human being on earth I don't think I can reach. And I know that sounds arrogant to some people, but it's just the fact that I've done this 30 years and I've never had anybody kill me.
Well, I
kind of messing with.
I think someone might use the term BS, but I think what you're saying is these guys don't give me any fluff. Tell me what's going on. Tell me what you
right.
see. Okay. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, we've got just 2 or 3 minutes left here. I want to give you an opportunity to take the floor here and just speak from your heart. We've got a lot of people listening who know family members or friends or loved ones of some kind that have served and that are struggling. They know they're struggling, but they don't even know where to begin. And maybe getting them a copy of this book or reading it first for themselves, whatever you got for us, lay it on it.
Well, Neil, I think it's important that we understand that we empower ourselves by believing that we can make a difference. People communicate in word, gesture, and spirit. And often the warfighters or people that are hurting do not know how to communicate by word, but they're still communicating by gesture and spirit. One of the things that all of us as human beings, especially compassionate human beings that really want to turn off all the negativity of the world and turn on themselves as a possible benefit or a helper, I think it's important for us to recognize that if we watch a person with compassion, that we may be able to see something that could save their life. There's so much judgment in the earth. There's so much negativity in the earth. If we would just turn our hearts toward helping our fellow man, especially, the officers, one of the things that I talk a lot about is the issue of affirmation. We live in a world that is de-affirming. Something needs to change in our culture to affirm people so that they recognize we see they're good and we tell them they're good. And when that happens, it switches the whole game so that we're able to speak into one another's lives and actually help each other. To the suffering veteran, I want to say this, Neil. I want to say there's hope. I know you've tried everything. I know you're at that place where you don't fear death. I know that you're at that place where there doesn't seem to be a moment that you have any rest and you just want to be better or gone. I'm going to ask you, please, don't be gone. You're a national treasure, and there is help and hope for you. And I will do everything I can to help other plans come together so that multiple things come into society that will make your life better. I want to thank you for your service, and I want to ask you to continue to let us, as people, enjoy the quality of who you are.
Amen. Monday, of course, we celebrate and remember. We don't necessarily celebrate, but we remember those who gave their lives. But I'm thinking that even based on what you just said, Greg, that message that you just communicated is so powerful, because those of you who have served and yet are suffering and think that maybe the world would be a better place without you, we need you, and we don't want to lose you. And I thank you, Greg, for going in that direction, because you need to speak directly. We all need to speak directly to people's souls, and especially words of affirmation, as you just said, to let people know that they are loved, needed, treasured, etc. And thank you for your time and your commitment putting this together with Ray Rodriguez, who served in the U.S. Marine Corps. You've been 27 years in leadership development for the military and law enforcement, and grateful for your time, Greg. Again, the warfightersoul.org if you want more on the organization and the work that Greg has done, thewarfightersoul.org, or get a copy of the book at Amazon.com. Greg, thank you for being with us. We'd love to have you back sometime.
Thanks, Neil. Happy Memorial Day.